Growing up, my mother often spoke of the ghost in her childhood home, a presence felt by all her siblings. One night, when she was just a child, sick in bed, she saw her first glimpse of it. An older woman, slightly transparent, walked slowly back and forth in the hallway outside her room. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, her layered skirts trailing as she moved. Their eyes met, and the woman never looked away. Years later, my mother and her siblings shared stories of seeing the same ghostly figure, always watching over them when they were sick, as if she was waiting for them to heal. My mother shared a bedroom with her sister. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, my mother asked her sister, "Could you turn off the light?" Just as she spoke, the light switched off on its own. My mother watched her sister, who hadn't moved at all, and saw the hallway light was still on. It was as if an unseen presence had heard her request and decided to answer it. In my mother's room sat an old red toaster on her dresser, positioned right in the center. One night, while she was sound asleep, she was jolted awake by a loud crash. She saw the toaster on the floor, far from where it had been, shattered and broken. Somehow, it had fallen with no one there to touch it, as if something invisible had thrown it with force. One of the scariest stories my mother ever told me was about her brother, Jay. He was sleeping peacefully in his bed when, out of nowhere, he felt himself being dragged by his feet to the edge of the bed. This was the only time anyone had felt the ghost physically touch them. Whatever he had done, the spirit seemed to be angry with him. This story terrified me so much that, to this day, I always sleep with my feet under the blankets. At one end of the upstairs hallway, a large old clock hung on the wall. My mother's brother, Jay, once saw a shadow move back and forth across the face of the clock, blocking the light. It was as if someone stood in front of it, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, yet this ghostly shadow continued to pace, filling the space with an eerie presence. Years later, when most of my mother's siblings had moved out, my younger aunts and uncles were woken one Christmas night by a strange sound. Someone was loudly humming jingle bells in the hallway. The next morning, they asked my grandmother if she had been humming, but she hadn't. Together, they decided it must have been their jolly ghost, spreading festive cheer. One afternoon, my grandmother and my mother's sister were home alone, busy baking in the kitchen. Suddenly, they both heard footsteps coming down the stairs, through the living room, and right into the kitchen. They turned, expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty. The invisible footsteps had stopped right behind them, as if an unseen visitor had joined them in their work. By the time my mother and her siblings had all moved away, my grandmother began to feel uneasy in the house when she was alone. She decided to say a prayer, asking the ghost to find peace and leave them. That night, my grandmother heard every cupboard door in the upstairs hallway being opened and then slammed shut, one by one. She later joked that the ghost was simply packing her bags. After that night, the house was silent, as if the spirit had finally moved on. My grandparents eventually sold the house, and my mother and her siblings moved to new homes, each with their own families. The ghost of their childhood home was never forgotten, though, and the stories have been passed down through generations. Even now, these tales linger in my mind, memories of a restless spirit that haunted my family's past.